Actually, the leap of faith, to give it the memorable name that Soren Kierkegaard bestowed upon it, is an imposture. As he himself pointed out, it is not a leap that can be made once and for all. It is a leap that has to go on and on being performed in spite of mounting evidence to the contrary. This effort is actually too much for the human mind and leads to delusions and manias. Religion understands perfectly well that the leap is subject to sharply diminishing returns, which is why it often doesn't in fact rely on faith at all, but instead corrupts faith and insults reason.
You are listening to A Leap of Doubt, the podcast that celebrates science, secular humanism, and the courage it takes to embrace an evidence-based life of doubt and questioning. Hello and welcome to A Leap of Doubt. Everything is fine. I am your host, Nathan Dickey. This week we are doing another philosophical deep dive into a television series. Those listeners of mine who have been with me since this podcast started may remember that way back in episode number 3, I was joined by Michael Schur and Jeremiah Traeger to discuss a number of the philosophical and ethical problems raised in the show Black Mirror. I like to think of this episode now as kind of the spiritual sibling of that early episode. Note, this episode does contain spoilers. This time I am joined by Rabi and Bethany Futrell to discuss The Good Place, a show which is a testament to the fact that sitcoms can actually be philosophically robust and make people think deeply about morality and ethics. Who knew? Aaron and Bethany, tell us a little about yourselves and the podcasts you each host and or co-host.
Thank you so much, Nathan. My name is Bethany. I am the co-host of Inciting Incident podcast with my dear friend Marissa McCool. On that show, we do interviews and talk to people who are participating in activism, occasionally have minor disagreements with people and or mini debates on issues of trans rights and so forth. And on that show, I am mostly the person who tends to, I'd say, clap back, as it were. I'm the person who says, hey, you can't speak that way about my friends, so that, preventing my friend from having to speak up about that kind of thing. I also have a solo show called She Talks Atheism, on which I discuss current events and try to put them into context. So that would be historical context, political context, information that helps inform what's going on today.
Very good.
My name is Aaron. I am the co-host of 2 philosophy podcasts, one with my longtime friend GW called Embrace the Void, where we cope with the living in the worst of all possible timelines by discussing philosophy and politics and various ways to try to band together and deal with all of this that we're dealing with right now. And then I have another show with Thomas Smith of the series Inquiries Only podcast stuff. We do a show called Philosophers in Space, where we take a specific sci-fi show every week or movie or book or whatever, and we use it to break down or make accessible some specific philosophical topic, kind of like we're going to be doing here today.
I just gotta say that I think Thomas Smith is trying to be in competition with Marissa for the most podcasts hosted.
Yeah, those two are always going to be going back and forth as
and
soon
I
as
don't feel bad enabling him. So that makes Bethany and I the top enablers, I think,
true.
Right?
That's an interesting way to connect or make a connection between the two of you being together on this show. And you also both have an interest in The Good Place. I know, Aaron, you have early on when the show started talked about or referred to The Good Place as a show that was like made for you.
Yes, I described it as a weirdly specific boon from the universe to me. I don't know why anyone else was enjoying it, but I was really happy they were because it seems to be sticking around. But it is the only show I know of that has a ethics professor as a main character. So it certainly caters to my personal perspective.
And just to get into a brief synopsis of the premise and storyline of the show, it was created by Michael Schur, who I believe is also the creator of Parks and Recreation. It is a fantasy comedy sitcom that explicitly incorporates ideas and concepts from moral and ethical philosophy via the narrative vehicle of a story about a group of people who die and find themselves in an afterlife. Here they meet Michael, designer and overseer of an idyllic utopia, the titular good place. This is said to be the destination of all those whose actions on Earth during life amounted to the most amount of net good as tallied by an elaborate and allegedly flawless, but as we'll discuss later, pretty arbitrary scoring system. In the first season, the show's main character, Eleanor Shellstrop, dies a grisly death in a supermarket parking lot.
How did I die? I don't remember.
Yes, in cases of traumatic or embarrassing deaths, we erase the memory to allow for a peaceful transition. Are you sure you want to hear? All right, so you were in a grocery store parking lot. You dropped a bottle of something called Lonely Gal Margarita Mix for one. And when you bent down to pick it up, a long column of shopping carts that were being returned to the shopping cart collection area rolled out of control and plowed right into you.
Oof. That's how I died.
No, sorry, there's more. You were able to grab onto the front of the column of shopping carts, but it swept you right out into the street where you were struck and killed by a mobile billboard truck advertising an erectile dysfunction pill called Engorgulate. Funnily enough, the first EMT to arrive was an ex-boyfriend of yours.
Okay, I get it, thank you.
Okay.
When she wakes up in the good place, she realizes a mistake has been made. She has been mistaken for another Eleanor Shellstrop, because apparently that's a name that
more than one human has. Yeah, unlikely.
Exactly. And she acknowledges that she has lived a life that was morally imperfect, to put it generously. The first season turns on the conflict of Eleanor trying to learn to become a good person with the help of a deceased moral philosophy professor named Chidi Anagonye. They are joined by two other characters who have also died and ended up in the good place, Tahani Al-Jamil and Jason Mendoza, aka Jean-Yu Lee.
For a second there, I thought you were going to say Chidi Anaconda or Chidi, what does she say? Ariana Grande.
Because you're a nice person. You're a nice person, Chidi Anaconda.
Anagonye.
Aganokomongo.
Anagonye.
Say it again?
Anagonye.
No, say what you said before.
I did. It's Anagonye.
You just changed it.
I didn't change it. It's my name.
Grande. Ariana Grande. That's a person. I did it!
That's not a gift. That's just basic decency.
There's a lot to unpack here. Where should we start?
I think we should probably get a basic definition of terms that we're going to be using in this episode. And I think that we should sort of very minimally unpack a couple of those terms for as they relate to the show. What do you think?
Sounds good to me.
Do we want to start by talking because the show does a really great job of pulling in actual philosophy. That's why, like, as a philosophy professor, I stick with it. It's not just that it's a wonderful show on so many other levels, but that it doesn't skimp on the actual references to real philosophy. And one of the ones that Nathan wanted to talk about some that I thought would be interesting was contractualism, which is it gets mentioned a couple of times in the form of Scanlon's book, What We Owe to Each Other. So maybe we could start there, yes. Perhaps. So first of all, it's a little hard to start here. I'm going to go into Chidi mode now, right? Let's start at the beginning. The reason I think the show picks Scanlon and contractualism and uses it where it does in the show is because it is far into the realm of ethical theory. It's not intro level. It's not utilitarianism versus deontology. It's like, it's once you've done the 100 level stuff, then maybe you can start reading some Scanlon and making some sense of it. Just because it's very sort of academically dry, meta-ethical kind of reasoning. So all that being said, right, the short answer is it's one of the kinds of views that defines morality around what we owe to each other where the answer to, as you wondered when in our chat at one point, what do we really owe to each other, is a reasonable explanation. So it says a good action is one where the principle behind it can't be reasonably refused by someone else from a rational perspective.
I think we skipped a step. I think we skipped the step of why should we be listening to these guys anyway? It's like, who died and left Aristotle in charge of ethics?
Well, so interestingly, contractualism is one of the kinds of views that says we don't need to do too much on that step.
The answer we were looking for was Plato.
Oh, yeah, Plato. You're right.
I'm listening. Are we sure we should be paying attention to these guys? It's like, who died and left Aristotle in charge of ethics?
Plato.
You're being more cheaty than cheaty is at this point.
I'm very bad at doing both at the same time on podcast. I have to admit that, like, my co-hosts will throw jokes at me, and I don't know how to do anything with it at that moment.
The question is, like, so these mostly men have come up with these ideas about philosophy and morals and ethics, and they want us to accept their perspective. I was just watching Scanlon on a YouTube video that Nathan had shared with us, all about, what is morality and his perspective on contractualism. And my question is, what puts them in a position to look at it from a different perspective than, say, me?
I don't think anything does, except any different. Well, like, here's what I would say. Any different than a chemical biologist is in a fundamentally different perspective or position than you, not a chemical biologist. You both have the same senses. You both have the same rational capacities. The difference is years of expertise and training. This is something that Chidi points out in the show. What he does is an actual job that requires actual study and skills, because a lot of the stuff that we talk about in ethics is very, very complicated. And it's very hard to talk about that idea within ethics, because ethics is different than a lot of other fields. If I say I'm a better marine biologist than you, I haven't insulted you in any kind of way, unless you really care about what people think about your views on dolphins, right? But if I say I'm a better ethicist than you, I've just said, in effect, maybe I'm a better person than you. And that people, I think, are resistant to the idea that certain people could have any expertise just because they've read more books on a subject
right, and that's
like
exactly.
ethics.
Oh, go ahead.
That's interesting, because that conversation happens explicitly in season 2 when Chidi tells Michael that an eternal being who, according to his own account, has, he says, I've been here a long time. In fact, all of it. And Chidi tells him essentially, yeah, you're an eternal, supreme, or superior being, but I just know more about ethics than you do.
Right. And that's exactly what I was trying to get to, is even before we talk about, all of the things, for the listeners specifically, just because we're talking about these things in weird terminology that, we're going to try to describe and make as understandable as possible, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're saying that we're better or more moral people, or that we know more. It's simply a matter of, like, this is what Aaron does for a living. And this is what, Nathan, I don't know what you do for a living. This is something that I have studied a lot. This is something that Nathan knows a lot. And that's all I was trying to get to.
Statistically speaking, ethics professors are just as likely or more likely to commit immoral acts than non-ethics professors. This is true. This is true science.
By the way, I have no expertise in moral or ethical philosophy, just a passing interest in it, just like I have a passing interest in a lot of things. I have a passing interest in too many things to become expert in any one of them. That's partly why I chose journalism as my major.
It. That's perfect. So that means that the only real expert in this conversation is Aaron.
I would not throw that term around too quickly either. Like, I'm young. I'm a little outside of a lot of mainstreams. A lot of people would not probably call me an expert, but I do okay.
So let's, so we talked about contractualism. Let's compare that to utilitarianism, which is something that I think it's toward the end of season 1. No, hang on. It's middle of season 2, I think, that Eleanor says, suddenly she's into utilitarianism. That's her thing. Can you break it down in very simple terms so that it's clear the difference between the two?
Sure. I think The best way to break it down is the way the show does with the use of the trolley problem. The trolley problem being this very famous thought experiment where you are at a lever that allows for a trolley to be on one track or another track, and the trolley is currently barreling out of control towards 5 individuals, and you have the power to switch the tracks of the trolley, at which point it will go onto a track where it will only kill one person. And the question is, what should you do in that situation?
Chidi? Talk it out, buddy. What are we thinking?
He thinks he just killed a bunch of people with a trolley.
It's just a simulation. I would never make you kill real people.
Oh, well, that's reassuring. Because some of the parts of the fake people flow into my mouth!
We can discuss each position, right? So the deontologist will take one position, and that's one view, and the utilitarian will take the other position. The utilitarian is the view that you should obviously pull the lever, that it's better to save 5 people by killing 1. The deontologist, the opposing view, would be it's better to not take a person's life merely to save 5 other people. And that's the very, very simplistic intro version of what these two views are, right?
I took a moral philosophy class in college, and the trolley problem was presented as, or the main dilemma, according to my professor, was, or the main reason that it's relevant to a lot of people and the reason it's famous is because it kind of kicks people in the gut when they try to think about what they're responsible for. So if you pull the lever, yes, you're going to save 5 people, but you'll be directly responsible for the death of 1. Whereas if you don't pull it and 5 people die, you're not actually committing an act yourself that results in the death of
No, but you've made
somebody.
a choice that results in 5 deaths, right? And that's when I was watching, so Vsauce, or not Vsauce, it's the new show that they do. They actually did the trolley problem in real life where they set it up and had video of trains and so forth. And they made it seem to the people who were participating that they were actually in a little place where they could do the switching of the tracks. And the guy who was supposed to be handling it has to step out and take an important call. And that's when the choice comes in. A lot of them, I think most of them, their first inclination was bring back the person of authority. And so they immediately, when they see it, and it's happening very slowly, they first, open up the door and try to find the guy who's supposed to be doing this because they don't want that responsibility. And the moment they realize that it is their responsibility, he's not coming back, the vast majority of them just sit and stare at it. That's the reaction that most people have. It's not even a moment of choice. It's a moment of, I have no idea what to do in this situation. There are a handful of people who see what's happening and make that moral decision and pull the lever. And it's really, really intriguing. I don't know if either of you has actually seen that.
Yeah, and there's a lot of confounding variables here. It's hard to know exactly what that study actually shows or proves. I mean, it's hard to even disentangle things like, is the person freezing a form of making an ethical decision, or is it a fact of their psychology as a human being that they just shut down rather than making a decision?
Yeah, a lot of what they talk about on the show, and it's a show about being a hero, and making that choice. What they talk about is moral luck. They don't say it in that terminology, but they talk about a person's circumstances and even just the way a person has grown up, and their experiences in their life will inform whether or not they're willing to take that moment, take that leap, and be a hero in a small way. And obviously the trolley problem is not necessarily a heroic moment, but they're talking about that in that term.
Yeah, I guess I just want to be careful and say, we say in ethics, we want to split the conversation between descriptive and prescriptive. So it's one thing to say, what do humans do when put in this situation? And it's another to ask what they ought to do. So it might be that most human beings don't pull the lever, but they ought to, for example. The utilitarian, the main thing that drives their view is consequentialism. They're a consequentialist kind of view that says all that really matters is what are the better consequences. And in this case, the better consequences is saving 5 people versus saving 1 person. That puts them up against deontologists and a variety of other views that will say that there are other fundamental factors that have to be included alongside consequences when determining what you ought to do. Things like the autonomy of agents. Like, it's not, if you flip the scenario, for example, like they do in the show, and put it into a hospital, right? And we get our good old friend Murder Hospital, where you can kill one person to save 5 people, then people's intuitions often flip, which is really interesting because numerically nothing has changed about the consequences.
And I think that qualitative kind of difference in that different scenario also highlights the element of being personally responsible or taking an action that directly makes you responsible for the death of somebody versus passively witnessing 5 deaths that you could have avoided.
I don't know. I think when you change it from the trolley problem to the hospital situation, to that context, you are the doctor who has to actually physically do the killing of the person. Whereas in the trolley problem, you're just flipping a switch. And so you are not the implement of death, right? You are not the actual, just saying it moves you closer to, from a psychological perspective. And that's maybe why people are more likely to say, no, I wouldn't do that, because you are physically the implement of death.
Right. And what we might wonder is that proving a fact about human psychology, that proximity to the harm you have to cause limits certain people psychologically and what they're willing to do? They do another version of the trolley problem where it's like, if you could push a really big person onto the tracks as a way to derail the train, would that be equally as moral as pulling the lever? And most people will flip as well and say, no, it isn't. Mm-hmm. Suggesting that their initial reaction about not pulling the lever might have less to do, or their initial reaction of being able to pull a lever might have more to do with being separated from the thing than anything else, like you're saying. But again, we want to be careful and say, does that tell us anything about what we ought to do? Is there really a difference in violation of someone's personal autonomy, for example, when you push them off versus when you pull the lever? Or is this just about our squeamishness towards getting our hands?
It's absolutely the latter.
In a moral
absolutely
situation.
The latter.
Yeah. And if that's the case, that doesn't seem morally relevant at all.
Right. And that's the point, is that, so contractualism and utilitarianism, are they providing us with those ought statements?
That's their goal, is to say you ought to do this thing, not just what you're going to do. That's the real point of ethics. Moral psychology's purpose is mostly to say, here's what you are more or less likely to do in these moral situations.
So the position of the single person on the other track, mm-hmm. they might have an objection to being killed, but the point of contractualism would then be it's not a reasonable objection.
Yeah, so Scanlon tries to cash out his idea of reasonable rejection of something as being like, if there is some greater, like I said to you when we were chatting before, like a lot of these theories end up sounding very similar when you get down to nuts and bolts. Like what he's going to say is a reasonable rejection would be if you talk to the person and said, look, if we don't kill you, these other 5 people are going to die. You have to understand that it's more important to save them than you, that it wouldn't be reasonable for them to say, no, I would rather die, or I'd rather live and let those 5 people die. Mm-hmm. I would say, though, that is not a perfect solution to the problem. I'm not necessarily a contractualist. I think it's an interesting attempt to bridge deontology and utilitarianism, actually. It's a blend of the two of them, along with the social contract doctrine of like John Rawls, but it still has a lot of the same problems when it comes to undergirding it metaethically and when it comes to convincing other people that this is what they ought to do.
What ism does Michael's solution to the trolley problem have? Where does it fall?
Michael's solution would be like a kind of anti-utilitarianism, where it's like the goal is to maximize harm.
No, not in season
pleasure.
1, in season 2.
Yeah, when he decapitates the other guy.
They're both in season 2. When he pushes Eleanor through the portal.
Oh, this is a really good question. So there is actually a later paper after the original trolley problem, revisiting it, that asks a separate question about what if there's 3 tracks and you're on one of the tracks and your lever can drive the trolley either towards you or towards the one other person or towards the 5 people? Are you morally allowed to switch the trolley and kill the other one person if you choose not to kill yourself?
Well, for me, morality comes down to minimizing suffering, right? Minimizing harm. So is it an equivalent amount of harm?
If you kill them versus yourself, yes. It's one person either way.
They're morally equivalent in that view.
So you would say it's okay for you to kill that one other person and save yourself?
I would take the trolley.
You would get hit by the trolley. And most people, I think, want to say they would do that, even if they realize that in the moment they might fail to be the good person they want to be.
For me, it's different, perhaps, than for another person, because my perception of the difference in suffering in ending my life and in ending the life of another person, this sounds really depresso, but it's not, is that the other person likely has significantly less suffering in their life than I do on a regular basis. And so ending my life is actually ending more suffering.
Okay, well, then for this hypothetical, imagine you live a good life.
Then in that case, I don't know.
Yeah, fair enough. A lot of my Embrace the Void listeners have that same problem with that thought experiment. They're like, well, I mean, obviously I kill myself.
Right.
What's the problem
for
here?
me, I live in constant chronic pain. So it's like, yeah, you live a better life than I do, probably. Please continue. So then what would we call that, though?
Different theories could answer that question. So utilitarianism would have the hardest time in theory answering that because the consequences appear to be the same. So what is it that makes it not okay for you to kill the other person and save yourself? Deontology has an easier time saying it. Contractualism has a really easy time saying it. Would you be able to reasonably tell another person, here's why I chose to do this and save myself and kill that other person? And I think you'd have a hard time making the case without sounding like a jerk, basically. Let me point out, this is why I actually think that, this is the other reason that I think that they used contractualism repeatedly in the show, or not use it, but Scanlon comes up a couple of times, is it takes a view of the ethical individual as part of a community as being the most essential thing, rather than the actions of the individual in an isolated, atomistic kind of setting. So whereas utilitarianism breaks an ethical action down to its consequences, deontology focuses on intent and the action itself, contractualism is about a good person is one who can live well in a good community. And one of the key themes of the show is these characters get better because of their relationships with each other. We see prior to their dying, they are not good people because of their relationships with the people in their lives. And when they are put in relationships with better people, their quality improves.
So they all ended up, spoiler, they all ended up going to the bad place because they were bad people, or rather not good people. And we'll talk about the scoring system. But the people in their lives were so terrible either to them or genuinely just terrible that when they're put in a position where they're with other people who went to the bad place, they get better.
Yep.
Lovely.
Pretty much. That's moral luck for you.
Do we want to talk about moral luck a bit?
Sure. It's my favorite hobby horse of all time, so I'm always happy to climb up for a ride. Yeah, moral luck is a concept that was made most famous by Thomas Nagel, which is the idea, and I feel like they're gonna go directly to this in season 3 at some point. The idea is you can only be held morally responsible for things that are under your control. And it doesn't seem like any of the things that you do are ultimately under your control. That's the problem.
Well, that's a combination of moral luck and determinism.
Determinism?
No, moral luck basically is, I mean, the view of moral luck that Nagel promotes, the scary problem of moral luck. Like if we say the problem of moral luck, it's that determinism is true. That's essential to the theory. In my view, right? You could have more mild forms of moral luck, but really the fear is once you let the problem in the door even a little bit, you realize that it's a problem all the way down across all the things. For example, in this story, we see that, especially in season 2, when we start to see what their lives were like before they died, that each of them, like you said, were taught by terrible people, surrounded by terrible people, and each of those terrible people shaped them in specific ways, right?
Let's talk about Tahani. Tahani al-Jamil.
Yeah,
Tahani is the perfect example of moral luck, in my opinion.
Right, and a perfect example of the complexities of moral luck, right? She's not poor like
Jason?
like Eleanor or Jason, right? She's not uneducated like Eleanor or Jason. She has everything except, as far as we can tell, the love and acceptance of her parents. And that lack of love and acceptance drives her shallow desire for affirmation all the time. It's her defining characteristic. And each of them has a defining characteristic that goes along with the horrible things they experienced in their lives.
Something 12-step Korean skincare regimen. I just, like 12 steps, that moment, and that's early in season 1, when she and Eleanor are first starting to become sort of friendly-ish. And she's, they're having tea in her sitting room, and she says she excuses herself to do 12 steps of skincare. Presumably, and it's the most confusing moment because you're in the good place. You're not going to age. Nothing's going to go wrong. Everything's fine with your skin. She's looking for continued affirmations the entire time.
Mm-hmm.
This is interesting because even if we don't anticipate right away what the twist will be at the end, we do know that something's off right off the bat. Like when I first watched the show, before I knew what the twist was at the end, that it's actually the bad place, I actually thought, well, maybe this is just highlighting the impossibility of a perfect utopia.
Oh.
I had a weird experience with it. From the first episode, was like, this is the bad place. And it was because it immediately reminded me of Starts No Exit. Which is a play about, it's the play that the famous quote, "Hell is other people" comes from.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about a bunch of individuals who are trapped in a place that they can't leave, where they just continually sort of make each other miserable through the course of the play. And I sort of immediately was like, oh, this has got to be one of those hell is other people kind of situations.
Right, and also Eleanor says, I think at the end of episode 1, that her parents are both passed away and that they are probably in the bad place and are likely being used to torture each other, and it would work.
I was an only child. My parents were divorced when I was a kid. They were both crummy people, so they're probably in the bad place. Maybe they're being used to torture each other. It would work.
Like, there are lots of foreshadowing moments where even if you don't get the, oh, this is the bad place right off the bat, you're getting the something is very, very wrong here. And it's not just Eleanor.
I love who figures it out first. Remember who figures it out first? It's Jason.
Oh, yeah.
If you watch, like 3 episodes in,
on
he's
a prank
like,
show.
We're being watched on a prank show. Yep.
You literally haven't said a word since we got here?
Yeah. When I say I'm meditating, I'm just trying to figure out what the fork is happening. I think we might be in an alien zoo or on a prank show.
No, Jean, you were dead.
Whoa, that's a dope prank. Gotta give it up.
I didn't pick up on that.
Yeah, so I think maybe alongside the reason I think the moral luck portion of this is so important is because the overarching narrative that I see in Eleanor in the story is this place is unfair because it doesn't account for a bunch of the complexities of real moral interaction, including things like moral luck. It takes this idea that, like, you can measure everyone's actions by some absolutist scale rather than having to take into account this person was coming from this really terrible situation, and so this particular action looks a lot less terrible in that context.
Is this why you would say that the scoring system in this afterlife is more like divine command theory than it is like utilitarianism?
Yeah, it's very rigid, absolutist. It's not explained. And there's a lot of evidence that we see in the show that these characters are good in the real world. They're just flawed. So one of my favorite moments is when Eleanor tricks her parents into showing up so that she can get them to sign emancipation papers. Like, she's this young girl who's been tortured by these people, and she still has the quality of being to get out of that environment.
That's exactly, I was going to bring that up as well, because we can liken it to something that a lot of times is said of slavery, wherein the only moral thing to say to a person who is enslaved is get out as soon as you can and take as many people with you as you can. And that's Eleanor's moment there of she's being tortured by her family, and the only thing to do, the only right thing to do is to get away. That's a perfectly moral action.
Yeah, and so it's weird. I think it's a mistake in such a flawed world, to take anyone who comes out of that world, judge them by this kind of system. And I can understand why we want to do it, like in a naive kind of way. We want the bad people to be punished and the good people to be rewarded. But it gets harder and harder to justify that the more you look at the realities of the good people and the bad people.
Right. And Eleanor tries to do this when, quote, real Eleanor shows up. They're sitting and they're having dinner that first evening, and the Eleanor we've come to know and love, original flavor, not new and improved, starts trying to describe her circumstances by saying, my parents were divorced and that can explain away a lot of behavior. And she looks like she's going to talk more about her circumstances, the context under which she performed these actions. And of course, they're torturing her. So instead, the other Eleanor goes into a tirade of all of the crazy shit that she fake went through and how she still became a wonderful person at the end of it.
One common pushback I think that moral luck people can make pretty effectively is against that kind of relative privation fallacy, where it's like, well, you didn't have it the worst, so your actions are culpable.
Right.
Right. But in reality, we all are dealing with the same stuff. We're all stuck trying to process through this. And while we can certainly say certain actions were better or worse than others, when it comes down to holding people responsible, it's very complicated how we can create a system that really truly distinguishes someone who is bad because they chose to be bad and someone who is bad because that was what they were taught.
Aaron just mentioned the specific actions aspect, and this is in our notes as well. Chidi's relationship with Kant, or Kantian principles, and his adherence to the categorical imperative of never telling a lie, which I think the show does a good job of showing why that fails on a practical level.
My question here is, so Aaron, you mentioned that the scoring system is very like divine command theory, which it very much is, but why does he subscribe to that?
Well, I don't think he subscribes to the scoring system. The reason I think he subscribes to Kantianism is because it attempts to provide very rigid, fully absolute, laid out answers. And he's a very insecure, unsure person. He has trouble, I think, with doing the kind of complicated, messy kind of ethics. So he wants something that'll give him a principle that says just never lie. And a lot of his growth over the show is having to realize that two-dimensional kind of Kantian view. I'm not saying all Kantians have to be that two-dimensional, but that he is the archetypal naive Kantian at the beginning of the show that has to be taught that, like, there's a lot more nuance to this than just you never lie and you win.
Can we talk about his boot brother?
Mm-hmm.
His boot brother. Yeah, a great example, right? You can cause a lot more suffering by not lying sometimes.
Right. Well, and that's the thing. So he could have either just said the boots are fine, not my taste, but fine, and gotten out of the terrible situation he ended up in. Or he could have gone back very shortly thereafter instead of waiting long enough for the guy to go out and buy him boots for himself and said, hey, you know what? I didn't really like the boots. Or just maintain the fucking lie, man. Don't wait for 3 years until dude is sitting in a hospital bed wearing the fucking boots that he loves so desperately and that you have given him a sort of right to wear because he was a little unsure about them and you said they're fine. Don't go in there and wait until he's being treated for an aneurysm 3 years later to tell him you hate the boots. That's unacceptable. That's not a moral act.
I have a theory about his backstory, by the way. We haven't found out all of it yet. He says that he was, like, born in Senegal and raised somewhere else. And like, we get one flashback to him as a child in what looks like a religious school of some sort. I suspect that his insecurity, his archetypal problem, is the result of coming from an insecure childhood, right? They all have different kinds of problematic childhoods, but his, I think, is one that seems to be marked by potentially strife, and as a result, he is a very anxious, insecure person.
I think that's likely, yeah. See, that's not much of a theory. I thought your theory was going to be all specific and exciting, but no, that's absolutely the case. Like, he's definitely from, at least he grew up in insecure in some way.
I coach it in those terms because I don't want it to be too racist to be like, well, anybody from Senegal would obviously have had a miserable childhood or something, but just to be like, maybe that what they are signaling here is that is why he is the way he is, and like Eleanor is the way she is because her parents taught her a bunch of really bad coping mechanisms. And then I love Jason's story the most. Jason was where I was like, man, where he talks about like how his school was just a bunch of like, what did he describe it as, like a bunch of
all tied together.
Empty tugboats. Yes. Like just in a field though, right? Not even in the water.
His greatest achievement in life was balancing water bottles on the roof of the
his
Pizza
greatest
Hut.
achievement in life was when he was watching it on the screen. His greatest achievement was coming up behind a weatherman who was reporting on a hurricane and thinking that it was what's his face from MTV, and getting on TV. That was his greatest achievement.
Jason seems to me to typify or exemplify the unexamined life, and he's somebody that would make Socrates roll over in his grave. Like, I drink hemlock for this, for people to be
also,
like this.
Chidi, I just remembered, was born in Nigeria and raised in Senegal.
Well, sorry, born in Nigeria, right, correct. I also think it's interesting with Jason because they have him being the fake Buddhist monk for a long time, and he does kind of exemplify no mind, which is the sort of Eastern ethical views about just go with the flow kind of mentality. And I think the contrast between his happy-go-lucky life and Chidi's constant nervous Western-style anxiety is an interesting critique of different ethical approaches.
Ignorance is bliss.
Yeah, in a sense. And like, I also enjoy that this show is not just ethically robust, but the characters are good people and likable, right? He's a lovable doofus, and there's no reason to not love him, even though he's this complete, he's just never going to be like Chidi. He's good for what he is. And I think her overall critique that like there should be a middle place is kind of an answer for all of us, right? We all deserve a middle place.
Is it the kind of middle place that Mindy St. Clair resides in?
No, God, that's like another form of torture.
It's so bad. Warm beer all the time and only, 2 movies? Come on.
Yeah.
No, it's a Cannonball Run 2.
Oh, is it Cannonball? I thought it was Cannonball Run 2 and something else, but not like Cannonball Run 1.
No, Cannonball Run 2 and the making of Cannonball Run 2 is... If it were really a middle place, right, she'd have cocaine like 3 days a week or something.
Yeah, she never gets her cocaine. I feel so bad for Mindy St. Clair.
Oh, no,
No,
her cocaine.
I mean, prior to that moment of here's a bunch of cocaine and a willing sex slave.
Which, maybe complicated.
He's not a person. He's a person, but he's not a person.
Janet, who's that man?
This is my new rebound boyfriend, Derek. I made him.
Hi, I'm Derek.
Janet, you can't make a person.
I know, but I did, though.
What's going on right now?
It's my first time making someone, so he might be a little bit off.
Okay, and that brings us to Janet.
That brings us to Janet, right?
We probably need to talk a lot about Janet because I think I might not be the only one who thinks that Janet is like the best character
in all of fiction.
In this.
Seriously, Janet is the best character in all of fiction.
And my future friend. One day.
She knows everything. She describes herself as the informational assistant in The Good Place. So she is, I don't know why we call her female, although I think Michael gets it started. Is that right?
She's not a person.
She kind of defies labels because she's constantly reminding people, no, I'm not a robot, and no, I'm not a female.
Girl so many times.
She does identify as a stone cold hottie.
Mm-hmm.
She definitely does that. But she gets something like 860 reboots. Is that right?
Yeah, something.
Some ridiculous
something like that.
Hundreds of numbers of reboots. And the really cool thing about Janet is that each time she's rebooted, she gains awareness and more skills. So, and this is my moral question regarding Janet. We'll talk about Janet in detail, I'm sure. Is it moral to continue rebooting her as much as you can in order to build her up?
I go with a hard yes, personally. I'm all for uplifting sentient beings, and I think she's clearly a sentient being after a sufficient number of reboots, for sure.
She starts gaining sentience on her second reboot, on her first reboot.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a functionalist perspective, it would be hard to deny she has some level of sentience even before then. But I think she clearly she develops not just minimal levels of sentience, but also like autonomy.
I agree. And what I'm referring to is when she and Jason get married, and she is concerned that she won't let Jason tell Michael that they've gotten married because she is worried about losing him and he will be sent to the bad place, and she doesn't want that. And she says that now that she can think and feel, she doesn't belong in that place either, and that's how they end up going to Mindy's. Right.
And then later, for example, you get her lying about her own feelings towards Jason, and she doesn't even know why initially, so she has an unconscious. Right. Yeah. So I think she's definitely a person, and, you know, should be treated as such. And I think that's a fascinating part of the story. It's one of my favorite parts is that the way that they describe, or they do her AI as getting more complex as she gets rebooted, is a very interesting, different take on artificial advancement compared to what you normally see in those sorts of stories.
Right. But if she's becoming a person, if she's gaining sentience and autonomy and all of that, and that's the question I'm asking is, at what point does rebooting her over and over again to help her grow become actually murdering her? Because each individual reboot does get dead. That series of memories and so forth goes into an unconscious of some kind.
Yeah, I guess after, I mean, there's probably no exact number. Like, that's one of those sort of sortery kind of problems where, like, when does the pile of sand become a heap? But, you know, I think once she starts to exhibit those autonomous behaviors, like being attracted or wanting something for herself, at that point, she has to choose voluntarily to reboot herself. You probably can't just keep murdering her to make her more complex, because even if she doesn't want you to.
Mm-hmm. It makes us think second thoughts about what's really going on when they do murder her by pushing the reset button. She's programmed to beg for her life.
I love that part so much.
Oh my gosh, it's so beautiful. And she holds up the first time she holds up the pictures of kids for Eleanor, and she's like, look at my kids, and she names them off. And one of them is battling asthma, but he's a fighter. And then Eleanor walks back away from the button and she's like, no, Eleanor, this is not real. I don't actually have kids. This is just a stock photo from children at the Nickelodeon Kids' Choice Awards. Like, it's beautiful. It's perfect in every way.
It's probably my favorite contrast between ethics and moral psychology, right? The ethics is so obvious, and yet the moral psychology won't let you do it.
Right. Which is why Michael has very little trouble doing it each time.
Yes. Michael is probably, I guess, another example of the moral luck thing, right? Can a being that is made to be evil still become good if it's put in a situation where it has to continually justify itself to actual moral agents?
He has a really, really tough time. He actually has to write 100 times on a chalkboard, good equals good, people equals good.
Yes, people equals good.
People equal good, people equal good.
And he just cannot, I love the existential crisis episode. It's one of my favorites. He cannot grasp the concept of death. He finally gets a little closer to grasping it, and he's like, you humans just accept it?
Right, and he goes straight into midlife crisis mode. Oh, it's so wonderful. And Jeanette in that episode is hilarious.
Yep. It's probably one of my favorite Good Place gifs is, existence is suffering and all that.
Birth is a curse and existence is a something. I don't remember the line.
We're all corpses who haven't yet begun to decay.
I particularly like the bit with Jeanette where he says, come on, honey, we got to get some food in you. And she says, I don't eat. Perfect. I was going to ask a weird question that sort of gets to, I guess, theorizing about future seasons. Are we expecting another twist?
No, I'm not. And what I'm expecting is what I'm hoping for is a big arc where they burn this whole thing down now.
That's what I would like to see. I'm hoping that they do it and that the judge ends up saying, wow, people can get better given the right opportunities, and they just burn the scoring system to the ground. Did we fully unpack the scoring system, by the way? I know we mentioned it.
I mean, pretty much. It's problematic in a variety of ways that sort of come out over the course of the show, right? Being French loses you points.
Yeah. Stealing bread. I love the Les Mis thing that Chidi gives to Michael to do as part of their good people lessons. So Chidi has Michael write up some sort of paper on the ethics and morality in Les Miserables, and he comes back with very little and all of the wrong information. And his response is, well, they're all French, so that's going to lose a certain number of points. And stealing bread is -5 points. And stealing a baguette is -10 points because it's more French. And it's just like all the way down. Even Jason, being from Florida, just being from Florida, dropped him a significant number of points.
That paper, by the way, is very reminiscent of the 101 papers that I get sometimes.
Oh, really?
I know that everything is wrong. This is wrong, and no, I'm just kidding. It just reminds me of like the things that I will get sometimes. There's a whole breed of intro level students who will come in, usually either nihilists or someone on the far left who wants to tell me that morality is all a joke, sham, something or other, and they're gonna upend the whole thing, and it's pretty funny. Pretty much always happens. And then they go through an existential crisis, much like Michael does. And then they have to cry about it and complain. And then we teach them moral luck. And
have any of them ever given you opposite tortures?
Nah. You mean presents?
No, thankfully.
No one's ever given you a present as a professor?
No, they haven't.
I don't understand.
Which is fine. It's okay. I don't need presents. Okay,
dear Aaron's students, Aaron needs an opposite torture stat.
It's awkward. And then, what if it's a nice present? It's too nice or something.
I was thinking like an apple. Isn't that the traditional teacher present?
Suppose. I guess I could eat an apple.
Yeah, apples are good.
All right, I'll take an apple. 1 apple, please.
Something I wanted to talk about that I don't think is discussed very frequently is compromise. This is really evidently shown in one of the flashback episodes. I think in season 1, Eleanor is thinking back to when she was in school, and it's all about not wanting to be part of a team, right? Not wanting to be part of a group, not needing to be in the in-group. And I'm sure that from a psychological perspective goes back to not having a good family unit and not ever feeling a part of a group. But she goes to this new school and they say, welcome to the home of the Scorpiotes. Half the school wanted to be the Scorpions and the other half wanted to be the Coyotes. So they compromised. And that just conceptually, compromise is so intriguing to me. There are some things on which you can actually compromise and end up with an even better result at the end. But in a lot of ways and at a lot of times, when you try to compromise on something, it just ends up with one person being unwilling to budge, right? And needing a specific or wanting a specific result, and the other person moving toward that person's results. Like when Chidi is just washing the dishes at Eleanor's place the whole time and she never even notices. He's like, okay, the dishes need to get done. She's never going to do it, so I'll just fucking do it.
So there's a couple of problems going on in there, right? So you've got the problem of free riders, which is people who will take advantage of the social contract. And then you have sort of the problem of radical centrism, which is thinking that the answer is always the balance between two extremes.
Right.
In a problematic kind of way. But of course, compromise is also an essential part of what happens over the course of this show. Like, the people have to see past their sort of two-dimensional views of each other and sort of compromise some of their own understanding of the world.
I don't know. I think what I was trying to get at is what you said there with the radical centrists who think that the mean between the extremes is always the right answer. And I disagree wholeheartedly. I think that so there's a thing that was going around on social media. Aaron, I think you saw it as well, where the right says, let's do genocide. And the left says, no, let's not. And the centrists say, okay, we're going to compromise. Let's just do a little genocide. The right says that's fine. And the left says no. And of course, then it ends up with the centrists and the people on the right saying, oh, you leftists, you're always the ones who are unwilling to budge. And that's what it comes down to, right? Is that radical centrism is not always right. And that needs to be sort of burned into people's minds.
Yeah, there's a difference between the golden mean in that, right? So the golden mean is Aristotle's idea that virtue lies as the mean between two vices.
Mm-hmm.
So being a courageous person is the mean between being overly cowardly and being overly aggressive or fearless to the point of insanity. But Aristotle, many, many years ago, already understood that in many cases and for many individuals, what is the mean will lean one direction towards one vice or the other as a corrective. So if you are, in a situation or you are an individual who is extremely prone to over drinking, then you will know that the mean for you is to, be more restricting in how you limit your consumption.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the same thing can happen in politics, right? It's, the mean can often be balancing the needs of the self and the needs of the other. But in some contexts, sometimes you give more weight to the self versus the other.
Sometimes in the political context that you mentioned, sometimes the mean or the middle is a far drag to the left or to the right, depending on whether you're in a fascist system or in a more left-wing totalitarian system.
I do think there's a sense in which all ethics is compromised because there are these irreducible ethical values like not harming others, helping others flourish, not violating autonomy. And each of these irreducible values come into conflict in a variety of circumstances and have to be weighted so that you have to make a decision. And people like Chidi have a lot of trouble with that kind of weighting process. But in a sense, you are always having to make a compromise between things like the best possible consequences versus how much autonomy you can take away from people. And that's where I think a lot of genuine reasonable ethical debate can and should happen. But that doesn't also mean that there are compromise positions on every specific issue. There is no compromise between pedophilia and not pedophilia. There's just one of them is right and one of them is objectively wrong.
Agreed.
Right. So that's why that's why you don't want Scorpiotes, right?
Yeah, the Scorpiotes is the funniest thing. Like, I mean, admittedly, it's a funny thing to have as your mascot. Like, that's hilarious. But also, you want your mascot to be something that people can get behind and is a positive thing for your school, as opposed to Scorpiotes as a compromise.
That's an updated version of the camel joke. You know the camel joke, right?
What's the camel joke?
The camel is a horse made by committee.
Oh, yes. So Pascal's wager, we all know it. It provides you with a sort of what if you're wrong kind of question. Like and I want to say it really simply, and Aaron, don't get mad at me for saying it simply. So you're provided with two options, right? You believe in a God or you fail to believe in a God. If you fail to believe in a God and you're correct, then you have, there's nothing positive or negative that happens to you. You're just gone when you die. If you fail to believe in a God and you're wrong, then you're tortured for eternity. If you believe in a God and you're wrong, then there's no negative ramification there either. If you believe in a God and you're right, then you get to go to the good place. So my perspective on Eleanor's behavior in season 1, up to the point where she understands that it's her motivation that's off, is a lot like an atheist being taken in by Pascal's wager, wherein I fail to believe in a God. I do not actually believe in a God. But if I am convinced that the result in what Pascal's wager is telling me, the result could be really negative for me if I'm failing to believe and am wrong, I can profess belief but not actually believe it. And that's where you get with Pascal's wager, is that it's not a form of convincing someone. It's simply a way of, getting people to say they believe when it comes right down to it. Much like Eleanor being told that she has to be a good person in order to stay. So she tries to do good people things but she's not doing it for a good motivation. Her motivation is off. She's not doing it for good reasons until that end point where she's like, oh, my motivation is wrong. I don't belong here. In order to stay, if I'm going to have any chance of staying, I have to leave. I have to leave this place and let these people continue forward in the good place, allowing this place to be the good place without me. But up to that point, she's just trying to learn to be a good person in order to stay.
Because all of a sudden she now believes in the bad place.
Right.
Yeah, so it is, I get what you're saying, that it is sort of similar to Pascal, though of course, like, because
not
she
in
knows
belief,
that it
but in
exists.
action. Yeah.
Right. It's also very similar to what we would call like the one thought too many problem, which is a common problem in ethics, where the reason you're doing it is often the wrong reason. So if I save you, it should be because I care about you, not because I measured out the utility and decided that saving you was a better utility than not saving you.
Right. And it brings to mind the example that Chidi gives of you can't wink when you say that.
Right. The
doctrine of double effect.
Mm-hmm.
Right. The double effect problem. Yeah. It's another version of that. I don't worry too much about the one thought too many problem, if I'm being honest. I feel like maybe that's because I am both an ethics professor and a dead-eyed sociopath, but because I can't turn it off, I just go with it.
I'm kind of the same way. Like, for example, I'm fascinated and intrigued by Richard Dawkins and other biologists being able to explain to me the biological justification for altruism, for example.
Yeah, and their claims about sympathetic altruism are both sort of scientifically and ethically somewhat problematic, but like I don't see anything wrong with the idea that part of the reason we are the way we are is because we evolved to be this way as social animals. I don't think that undermines the objectivity of morality at all.
Well, and it gets us back to the same thing we were saying at the beginning, the difference between is and ought. Yeah,
and it's just another layer of our moral luck. Right, it's a fact of moral luck that we happen to be social creatures, which gives us things like an inborn sense of fairness, which means that our moral reasoning is better able to track issues of fairness and unfairness, which is an advantage for us now. But we still have to go beyond purely what evolution gave us and figure out how to balance all of these different competing notions.
Yeah, we have to take cultural evolution into account, not just our biological evolution, because we're in a place now where our technological advancement has kind of outpaced our biological development. So we need to figure out, now that we have the means to take control, for lack of a better word, of the course we're going to take as a species, we have to really seriously consider cultural evolution and what we're going to do with that.
Can you expound on that? I'm not sure I understand what you're saying.
So there are biological realities that constrain us, but as a species, we've gained self-consciousness and awareness, mostly through blind accident. Having gained that awareness and self-consciousness, we have been able to experience cultural evolution. And that process of cultural evolution has taken us to the point where we have outpaced our own biological development so that we are still
warlike, for example. We're still a very warlike species, even though culturally speaking, we're trying to move past that kind of crap.
Yeah. So like if you take a hunter-gatherer from prehistory and plop him or her into the middle of modern day New York City, there's actually not any significant difference between the brain of that person and our brain. But we've become technologically advanced and we're actually not accustomed to it. So we're still trying to figure out what we're going to do with what we've created for ourselves as a society, how we've kind of taken the course of our evolution into our own hands. And so we're like children or toddlers in the context of the span of time that we've existed as a species. And we're playing with things that we don't fully understand yet. And so that's kind of what I'm getting at, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that definitely unpacks it significantly. And I get it. I'm with you on it for sure. I think that regardless, whether you take that hunter-gatherer, whether you take an early, Homo sapien farmer, anywhere along that line from that point, the physiology is very similar, but the technology is vastly different. So yeah, I'm with you on that.
I think it'll be a little more complex because I get what you're saying, that in that we have that Stone Age mind in our skulls, that Stone Age meat, and that it hasn't physically changed. But I would say that your brain is also impacted, your mind is also impacted by experiences. And so you are shaped by your experiences very differently than someone living at that time, like if you plopped him down in middle age, he would have been shaped by a very different set of experiences. So I don't know if I would say, I guess I would say it's not quite as grim, maybe, depending on how you take things, as you might make it sound in terms of the disconnect between where we are in our advancement culturally and biologically. There's been, I think there's some good evidence that for the past million years, at least, humans have been evolutionarily changed by culture, that things like our aggressive nature has declined as our social situations have become more effective, and that
I think it's cute that you think our aggressive nature has declined.
I think if you look at our aggressive nature compared to the aggressive nature of our biological ancestors, I don't think it's that hard an argument to make.
Are we going to have another argument about progress?
Do we need to bring Steven Pinker in on this discussion?
No, we're good. We agree. We agree completely. Aaron and I are on the same page on this. We have progressed, and our aggressive nature has declined, but not enough.
And it's very easy for our aggressive nature to be habituated back into that really horrible place.
Yeah.
Like, what I will say of human beings is what Aristotle says, right? We have the potential to be good by nature, but are made good by habit. And if you don't get made good by habit, there's no chance. Almost no chance. Very little chance. 2% chance. It's very, very hard. Right? Without a cheaty, you're in a lot of trouble, is what I'm saying.
So what you're saying is we need people like you to keep us in line.
Yeah.
We need moral philosophers.
We need moral philosophers, but we also need a safe environment in which to learn that. Because if you're trying to learn to be a moral person in an unsafe place, it's going to be really fucking hard too.
Right. It's not just cheaty as a teacher. It's also an environment where you are rewarded essentially for doing the right thing.
And this is really what the conflict in The Good Place is all about. It's learning to become a good person in a dangerous place.
I would say it's moderately dangerous. The danger is peripheral.
Because you can't die again? Or...
No, because the danger is being found out. But, right, because Eleanor, the whole time, and up until the point where they realize that it's the bad place for the final time, up until that point, she's taking action to ensure that she doesn't get caught. And that's really the only danger there.
What would you say is the danger or the central conflict in season 2? I don't know if I've quite figured that out, or what we should consider to be the central conflict, because it is distinct from what the main conflict in the first season is.
It is distinct.
I mean, it's an evolution of it rather than some of them being sent to the bad place. The threat is all of them are going to be sent to the bad place.
All of them. And also, I think it also hinges around Michael.
Michael will be retired, yes.
Yeah, Michael being retired, and or Michael, is he on our side or not?
Yes, right. Can you actually win?
I love the question of, is it possible for an immortal being to live an ethical life? I really like that question that gets raised.
Sure.
Like, what does ethics and morality mean to an immortal being?
Yeah, I start to wonder if a being like that can change. Like, ethics to me is about being able to grow as an individual fundamentally. And does an eternal being change and grow, or is he what he is from the beginning?
According to the show and Michael, it seems to be the case that he can grow.
Right. They give him the chance to set up his own neighborhood finally. That suggests that his skills improve.
No, I mean toward the end, when he actually makes a decision to protect others before himself.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that the whole point of the show is that everyone should be given a second chance because everyone has the potential to grow.
It seems like, going back to moral luck, it's something that applies even to eternal beings like Michael, because it's unclear in the show's cosmology or theology whether there is a central God overseeing everything, or whether it's a kind of a polytheistic universe.
Right. And we see Sean as being the judge, but Sean is not the judge. Sean is a demon pretending to be a judge. Oh, I'm sorry. Demon is a little bit racist. What were we supposed to call them? Anyway.
He is one of my favorite racist quotes in the show, by the way.
Which one?
I took the body of a middle-aged man so that I can only fail upward.
Yes. So we see Sean, and then we see the actual judge. But the actual judge is not a god figure. The judge is just like a being who, Jen, she came about very early on in the universe and knows everything she needs to know.
She still strikes me as upper middle management.
Yeah, I think so too. There's something above her.
Yeah, there's got to be.
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems like everybody, no matter how powerful, answers to somebody else, and it's not clear where that hierarchy ends.
Mm-hmm.
I think the thrust of the show is going to be to get us there and have them argue with that person.
Right, and burn the craziness to the ground. I agree.
Burn it down. I really hope at some point Jason will throw a Molotov cocktail at God. I think that would be
awesome.
Pretty good.
I want that so bad.
It's going to be something like that, I think.
Aaron was going to tell me why my afternoon snack is immoral.
Oh, yes. Go ahead and convince us.
I can give you a depressing, cheaty monologue. So all of your actions, as dirty liberals will like to tell you, can have some sort of moral valence to them. And I say that, right, you could probably maybe find something sufficiently trivial that you might have a case that the moral valence is so thin that as to not be worth considering. But realistically, the vast majority of your actions have a moral factor to them. And you may not be consciously aware of it, but you can become more consciously aware of it if you attempt to. Right, so your example was, can you have a banana in your office? What's the moral reality of that? And the first question I asked you was, where does the banana come from? What kind of banana is it? Is it a genetically modified banana? Are the people who
all bananas
raise
are genetically modified?
Sure. Is it
by definition?
Is it a newly right? Right. All of these kinds of questions, and all of those might have different moral factors to them.
That's interesting because moral valence might be a clue as to why Chidi is in the bad place to begin with. He's pretty confident that the reason he's there is because something about
almond milk.
Almond milk. And that's never really debunked or...
Nobody says it so many times.
That is sort of a good example, right? He's there because he can't weight moral valences properly. He really does take everything. It's like a basically obsessive compulsive ethicist, right?
No, he's there for an additional reason beyond that. He's there because he can't weight the moral valences properly, and therefore negatively impacts the lives of the people around him.
Right. His obsessive compulsive disorder leads to him being dysfunctional for everyone around him.
Right.
When he's forced to choose between two hats that are identical.
It takes him 90 minutes or something ridiculous.
Right. And I don't want to sound ableist when I say it's obsessive compulsive. Like, the diagnosis of obsessive compulsive disorder is unable to properly value the importance of different things. You can't tell the difference between a really important choice and a not important choice.
Point of order. Much more to it than that.
That is
it's one part.
That is one major part of obsessive compulsive disorder.
Oh, that's a necessary part. I'm just saying there's a lot more to it than that.
Sure, right. But that is at the root of the problem for as far as I know.
I love that line when Michael is critiquing Chidi's book. And he says, in section 1008, you started by saying, of course, the complete opposite of all this may be the case.
Oh, yeah. Yep. What does he say on page 1008? You begin part 2 by saying, of course, the exact opposite may be true. And I swear, the first time I watched that, I laughed so hard I missed the whole rest of the conversation. Because that is so... It's so cheaty. It's like it states his essence so perfectly, but also like, isn't that what we all do? Just a little bit to a degree. Like, if we're actually thinking through a thing, if we're thinking through the moral or ethical implications of a thing, the discussion that we're having even right now is, okay, all of these things are likely, but of course the exact opposite may be true.
Yep. That is the existential crisis that we all face every single moment of every day. That's why everybody hates ethics professors.
Why don't you just tell me the right answer?
Well, that's what's so great about the trolley problem is that there is no right answer.
This is why everyone hates moral philosophy professors.
I'm on your side here, dude, but he is not wrong.
I don't hate ethics and moral philosophy professors. Is that bad?
Appreciate that.
Am I supposed to hate you?
No, you're not going to have any choice either way.
That's absolutely the case.
But I do think that he is a wonderful critique of academic philosophy, academic ethics especially, that like in place of being a useful system, it often gets caught up in a bunch of navel gazing, creeps up its own butthole kind of reasoning, and like it stops being helpful for human beings. And I think it's more important that this stuff should be helpful for humans, which is why I love that The Good Place took all of this stuff and made it accessible for normies, because I'm shocked that everyone else likes the show.
In kind of the same way as Westworld is popularizing philosophy of mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Apparently, I need to watch that show. I have not yet.
No, I'm not sure that's a show for you.
Oh, thanks.
What I mean to say is it's a show that's not good to women a lot of the time.
I appreciate that. In that case, maybe I should not watch that show.
There you go. I don't mean it because you wouldn't appreciate other parts of it.
I was going to say, that's a little hurtful, Aaron, but no, I'm with you now. It's because of my vagina.
It raises the stakes by abusing women.
Yeah.
It doesn't have an anti-woman stance. It just has that as a theme among the more villainous characters, and it's potentially triggering to a lot of people.
Right. I mean, I like Westworld for what it does, but it is so much in the vein of HBO's torture historiporn that I wonder if it is itself a send-up of their model. That's how much it dives into that, like, isn't this a little gratuitous, guys? A little bit.
Jeez.
Yeah, I can see that. Going back to The Good Place, I want to end by kind of being intrigued by the parallels I see between The Good Place and ancient epics. Like I talked about the show kind of being a modern retelling of the Divine Comedy. And I think that comes out even more clearly in season 2 with their journey through the bad place and their journey through the various levels of the afterlife. I'm speculating that theme is going to be explored further. I really like what Aaron said in the pre-show chat about The Good Place potentially being more like Paradise Lost and being about something we've alluded to in this discussion already, rebelling against the system and toppling it.
That's what I'd like to see. And I get your point. You see, I didn't get the Divine Comedy aspect of it in the pre-recording chat, but I see your point of viewing it from different, we'll call them circles. But what I'd like to see is, as we discussed before, a movement up the chain of command, right? So instead of a movement through the circles of hell, it should be a movement up the chain of command till you get to the God figure, whatever that is. And then Jason throws a Molotov cocktail at it.
I definitely see the similarities, right? So they start off in hell, much like Dante does. They go through the middle place. I think in season 3 are probably going to end up in the actual good place, which might be where God is located or whatever. And there's also stuff like they're being led by a variety of sort of wise, learned people. So Janet could be viewed as Virgil. I think it's sort of funny that all the philosophers are in the real bad place and the other bad place, so we never see them the way we do in the Divine Comedy. It might have been fun to see Aristotle show up in this place at some point.
That was interesting to me when, at the beginning of season 2, Michael tells Chidi that none of the philosophers made it to the good place.
But that could be a lie for all we know. Like,
that was what I was trying to get at, is that there's got to be something that we believe to be true about this world that isn't.
Uh-huh. Oh, I see. Yeah.
The thing that's interesting to me about that is not whether it's true or not, or whether he's lying or not, but Chidi doesn't ask the obvious question of, am I not a philosopher? He just is like, oh, interesting. None of the philosophers made it to the good place.
Right. Yeah. He doesn't ask the follow-up. Do you think he's thinking it and is just too afraid to ask?
Or it's just showing his uncertainty about everything once again. Like maybe he doubts his own value as a philosopher in that moment.
Maybe.
And just accepts that the reason I'm not in the bad place with Kant is because I wasn't as good at him at being a philosopher.
Well, but he's in the good place and they're not, because he's a I think you can also just read it as like a little bit of simple hubris that like he did better at philosophy than all of them. Like they're even worse than him or something.
He doesn't seem like a big enough narcissist to believe that.
No, but I mean, honestly, I think it's just like a throwaway joke that doesn't make sense if you think too long about it, but...
Yeah, I'm probably overanalyzing that bit of dialogue there.
It is the kind of show that lends itself to overanalysis.
Otherwise, we'd all be cheaty.
Yep.
Okay, well, is there anything else we want to hit on? Or any way to bring this to a close that makes sense?
A close that makes sense. Do you want to be cheaty or do you want me to be Janet?
I don't know. You be Janet.
No, you be cheaty first.
The close is there is no close, right? It's always more work to be ethical, and that's why it doesn't make sense to have a good place. It doesn't make sense to have an end point where people are judged in some final way and given a final score, because it's always an ongoing process.
Fun fact, Janet is me.
I think we've covered enough. I think we've done a sufficient job of unpacking some of the ideas and concepts in this show that might get some people interested in it or reinterested in it, whatever the case may be. Aaron and Bethany, where can people find your stuff?
People can find my stuff at Embrace the Void or Philosophers in Space on all the major podcast apps. I mostly spend my Twitter time at ETVPod. Yeah, look us up.
You can find Inciting Incident podcast on pretty much all the podcatchers, or just Google Inciting Incident podcast and you'll find us. She Talks Atheism is available on most podcatchers and should be being updated to all very soon, as well as I'm available on all of the various internets. She Talks Atheism on Facebook, Bethany Futrell on Facebook and Twitter, and She Talks Atheism on Twitter as well.
Awesome. And all my information is already in the outro that I've already recorded, so you'll hear that once we close. Thank you, Aaron and Bethany, for joining me for this discussion.
No, thanks for having us.
I was delighted.
Thank you for listening to A Leap of Doubt. If you liked what you heard, please consider leaving a review on iTunes. If you want to get involved in the kinds of discussion this show is meant to encourage, you can find the official discussion group on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/A Leap of Doubt. You can follow me and get in touch with me on Twitter, where my username is @TheNatheist. Feedback and criticisms are always welcome. The opening clip is an excerpt from the audiobook God Is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens, courtesy of Hachette Audio. Text copyright 2007 by Christopher Hitchens. Audio production copyright 2007 Hachette Audio. Used with permission. The opening and ending music is Jade by Esther Nicholson and is used under license. The audio was edited by Rich Lyons of the Living After Faith podcast. If you enjoy the work I do, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon at patreon.com/A Leap of Doubt.